Hey, everybody, it's Alex with Reportify Media and WCICO. I'm here with Chris Halali. How are you, Chris?
I'm doing very well. Nice to be with you. A pleasure to be on the show with you.
Thanks. It's been a few months since we've seen each other face to face, especially down there in the Donbass region of Russia. And now we are on other sides of the pond again here in China. Thank you, Chongqing. And yourself, you're back in Moscow, I believe.
That's right.
So let's jump right into this. I mean, you were recently in South America covering, I can imagine, quite a controversial conference, we'll say, COP30. And maybe tell us about your experience there. And of course, I'd like to hear your insights on China here. There's been a recent spat between China and Japan. I'd like to hear your insights on that because you're very well up to speed with most of that things, and move on with geopolitics in 2026, where we're going from there. I'll hand it over to you.
Sure, of course. Well, first and foremost, COP30, as I'm sure your viewers and listeners will know, is the United Nations Climate Conference. So it's basically the opportunity for world leaders to come together, along with NGOs and other activists, to come together to try to find solutions for some of the issues affecting the climate and our world today. Now, this conference was held in Belém in Brazil. So it's in the northern part of Brazil on the Atlantic coast. And it was attended by tens of thousands of people. Belém's very small, but it's the gateway to the Amazon. So it's right on the Amazon River, right where it begins to flow into the Atlantic. So it was very amazing to be part of that and to see that. One of the major issues this COP30 was that there were over 1,800 lobbyists from fossil fuel industries. It was heavily attended by a lot of the big corporate interests. And of course, indigenous people and Afro-descendant people were blocked from participating, were blocked from having a voice. And I was involved, along with some other great activists and journalists and intellectuals, at a booth dedicated to talking about what's going on in Gaza, what's going on with Palestine, and the ecocide which Israel was committing and is continuing to commit against the Palestinian people. That is the destruction of water, sanitation, the use of all of these weapon systems that absolutely made the land uninhabitable. So I thought that it was very important for us to be there to speak about these things. But most important, it was important to be there to see all the different aspects of how the diplomacy, political work, but also the financial interests coalesce at such a big conference like this. So it was amazing. I was with some prominent people that I'm sure your listeners and viewers know, including Tim Anderson, Ajamo Baraka, Angelo, who's over in China, Bushra Sheikh. It was a phenomenal trip. But to sum it up, of course, COP30 is meant to address many of the climate issues. However, of course, it has still failed to yield tangible results. And that's not because of the will of the global south. It's really the dominance of the global north continuing to exert its pressure and control over resources, and not looking at sort of, increasing people's livelihoods and well-beings, but continuing to serve corporate interests. And that becomes a major stumbling block, of course, to addressing any major issue in our world today. Of course, on to the next question that you mentioned, which I think is very important, speaking about what's going on with China vis-a-vis Japan. Of course, your viewers and listeners will know, and I having lived in China for 2 years and studying my master's degree there, I know very well the tension that exists, geopolitically between the two. But of course, an understanding of history is paramount, because that history still goes unaccounted for, and there still has not been a proper reckoning for that history. Of course, your viewers and listeners know that Japan invaded China and committed massive atrocities, including a genocide of the Chinese people. Up to and over what we think 30 million Chinese were killed during the invasion and the occupation of China. And so when you understand that history, and when you know things like what happened in Nanjing and what happened all throughout China in that time period, you understand that the Chinese, of course, are still deeply concerned about the historical revisionism that goes on in Japan. Japan still, for example, does not acknowledge the crimes that they committed in China. not only the killings and the destruction, but also the abuse, the rapes, you name it, the crimes against the Chinese people writ large. They still haven't accounted for it, and they still haven't even paid proper reparations, which has been an important issue as well.
Massively. Yeah.
Massively.
Totally agree with you.
You know that. And so at this point, Japan's government has been moving more and more towards a nationalistic strain in politics. So it's becoming much more militaristic. It's sort of rekindling that spirit that was in the imperial phase and in some of the worst parts of its history. And so that's been a very deeply disturbing thing for not only China, also for the DPRK and for other countries that were affected by Japanese imperialism. So we have a new leader in Japan, and she's made it very clear that she wants to make Japan great again. She's very much of that strain of thought. And we know from the previous leaders that there has been commemorations of the Japanese war heroes and the warriors who died during the Second World War, and even earlier. There has been sort of this revisionism that Japan somehow was the victim, when it wasn't the victim, it was the aggressor. And it was part of the Axis powers allied with Nazi Germany and fascist Italy. So all this needs to be understood. The problem is that Japanese history has been modified, much like American history has been modified to discount the role of the Soviet Union during the Great Patriotic War. And this is why both China and Russia today agree on the proper interpretation of the history and their contribution, which was the main contribution to the victory over fascism in the Second World War. So this is to say that the current situation, of course, is deeply mired with this historical layer, below it, and above it, the geopolitical concerns, which are a Japan that is much more belligerent than it has been in previous years, much more militaristic, advancing its military, trying to move away from basically US control over its military to firm its own positions. And we've seen issues off the coast. We've seen issues related to different islands and the projection of their military power vis-a-vis the Japanese military against the Chinese. So there's a lot of concern here. And I hope that people understand that until Japan understands China's concerns and has a reckoning with its own history, these ongoing diplomatic spats will continue. And I think that's very important to recognize at this point.
It's interesting because when I met you, over 6 months ago, your intellect and understanding about China and its history was very impressive. And now we're seeing, what you have gathered in information and studied, pardon my camera for a moment, but what you have studied is really now coming to be extremely important in the geopolitical landscape today.
You're absolutely right. History and a historical understanding and a proper historical context and framing is essential to understanding many of the issues in our world today. Not only China, Japan, not only, for example, in Israel, Palestine, but in every place, even Russia, Ukraine. There are so many places where history is essential. Venezuela, for example, that we mentioned. All of this is very important because I know that for the United States and for some Western listeners and viewers, there's a type of amnesia. And we know Gore Vidal's famous quote that it's the United States of amnesia, not the United States of America. And that's to say that these countries, because of their culture, because of their economy, because of how they're set up, they're consuming information, but not really understanding it and recognizing it, and not really having it be a deep part of their identity. Whereas, for example, China and Russia, Iran, Venezuela, these are civilizational states, some younger, some much older. Of course, China has over 5,000 years of history, Russia over 1,000 years of state history. So all of that to say that they are not newcomers on the block. And for them, their history is very important. It's integral to who they are. And they have profound and long histories. So until we understand history, we won't have a proper grasp of a lot of the geopolitical conflicts, a lot of the issues facing different countries and different peoples around the world. And I hope that our viewers and listeners and everyone continues to study history, to understand it, and that will further deepen their understanding of different countries and their positions vis-a-vis different conflicts and issues around the world.